Okay, let's unpack this. You know how sometimes you see people out there, maybe running businesses, maybe even in fields we admire, who seem to get ahead using methods that, well, they make you raise an eyebrow?
Yeah, definitely. People who cut corners, maybe they're hyper-competitive.
Exactly. And yet they seem to be the ones celebrating the big wins, launching the next successful thing. It makes you wonder, especially if you're trying to build something carefully with real values. Like, why do some seemingly worst people achieve such, well, extraordinary success?
It's a question that really hits home, doesn't it? And what the sources we looked at suggest, pulling from history, psychology, and some really interesting philosophy, is that this isn't just, random chance. There seem to be actual forces at play here.
Right. It feels like this uncomfortable truth we kind of dance around sometimes. You see it across history, don't you? Ruthless emperors, cutthroat CEOs.
Absolutely. Individuals who weren't exactly known for their gentle approach often reach the very top.
So it forces you to ask that difficult question. In the real world, is being highly ethical actually a disadvantage when you're aiming high?
That's the core of the paradox, isn't it? Our deep dive into different viewpoints keeps highlighting this pattern. People who aggressively pursue their goals, sometimes without much regard for the impact on others, do seem to climb the ladder in all sorts of fields.
But hang on, it's not always a success story forever, is it? Because history is also full of examples where those ruthless types have a spectacular fall from grace.
That's a really crucial counterpoint. You're right. While that no-holds-barred approach might bring quick results...
Yeah, short-term gains.
Exactly. The sources also show plenty of evidence that it's often built on shaky ground. It doesn't necessarily last, which makes you think, what really does sustain success long-term?
Which kind of brings us to Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, his name can sound a bit intense, maybe academic, but his ideas about power are actually super relevant for understanding this, aren't they? He didn't automatically see power as this, evil, corrupting thing.
Precisely. That's what's so useful about his perspective here. He viewed power as this basic, neutral force of life. Not good, not evil in itself. Just a drive to exert influence, to achieve your will. And to really get why some people we might judge harshly seem to succeed, we kind of need to look at his ideas of master morality and slave morality.
Okay, master morality.
Yeah.
Let's start there. That sounds like the mindset of the people in charge, the rulers, the conquerors.
That's a good way to put it. Master morality for Nietzsche is the value system created by the strong, the leaders, the innovators. They essentially define their own good.
And what does good mean to them?
It means things like strength, courage, ambition, power, basically anything that helps them dominate, create, assert their will.
So not necessarily kindness or fairness as we usually think of it?
Not primarily, no. In this framework, good is what enhances their ability to achieve their goals, to shape their environment. They're self-reliant, they don't really look for external approval, and they see weakness as something to be overcome, not coddled.
All right, you can picture that type. Decisive, maybe a bit intimidating. Okay, so then slave morality must be the opposite.
It is. It arises from the perspective of the oppressed, the powerless. So instead of valuing strength and ambition, it emphasizes virtues like humility, obedience, empathy, patience.
Things that help you endure when you don't have power.
Exactly. Suffering might even be seen as noble. And power itself, it's often viewed with deep suspicion, maybe even seen as inherently corrupt or evil.
Okay, so Nietzsche saw this as basically a survival strategy for those without direct power.
He argued it developed precisely for that reason, as a way to cope and find meaning. But, and this is where it gets really crucial for our question, he believed that by condemning ambition and the drive for power, slave morality can unintentionally leave the path open for those who operate by, let's say, different rules, those who don't see ambition as a bad thing.
I see. So by judging the drive for success negatively, it sort of gives a free pass to those who aren't bothered by that judgment.
That's the provocative idea, yes. While someone adhering to slave morality might hesitate, worried about fairness or hurting feelings, someone with a more master orientation, maybe even a distorted version of it, feels much less constrained.
Which brings us right back to ruthlessness, because that often seems like a defining trait of these people who climb so fast.
It definitely comes up a lot in the analysis. Think about it like the raw, untamed wilderness. Survival there isn't about being polite.
Right. It's about strength, adaptability,
and a willingness to do what it takes.
So are you saying that even in our complex societies, there's still some kind of primal battle going on underneath.
The sources suggest that beneath our social contracts and rules, there's still a fundamental level of competition. And in that arena, ruthlessness, and let's define that carefully here, maybe as acting decisively, without crippling hesitation or guilt, not necessarily just being cruel.
Decisiveness.
That decisiveness can be a real advantage.
We're talking about those individuals who just seem laser-focused on their goal, and the collateral damage doesn't seem to slow them down much.
Indeed. And psychology offers some clues here, too. Research suggests successful people in highly competitive areas often show traits like very high ambition, maybe a lower sensitivity to fear or negative outcomes.
Less worried about failing.
Perhaps. And potentially sometimes reduced empathy, particularly towards those perceived as obstacles.
And that sounds uncomfortable, but you're saying it doesn't automatically mean they're like psychopaths or just bad people.
Not necessarily. It's more about highlighting traits that enable rapid, decisive action, taking big risks, making tough calls without getting bogged down by the emotional weight that might stop others. History is full of examples, right? From Julius Caesar to modern business titans, where hesitation could have been fatal to their ambitions.
But like we said, pure ruthlessness isn't the whole story. It can blow up in their faces.
Absolutely. It's not enough on its own, and it can absolutely lead to downfall. Think of tyrants consumed by paranoia or overthrown because they alienated everyone. The very things that help them rise can become their undoing if there's no balance.
It really feels like we keep bumping up against this idea that the world, well, it just isn't inherently fair, however much we might wish it was.
The sources really challenge that comforting belief. We often internalize this idea that good deeds get rewarded, bad deeds get punished, that things will eventually even out.
The universe keeps score, kind of thing.
Yeah, but the reality we observe doesn't always match that neat picture. Fairness, in many ways, might be more of a social construct we create for order, not necessarily a fundamental law of how things work.
And believing too strongly that life should be fair could actually be a problem. Like, if you're just waiting for fairness, you might not take the actions needed to succeed in a competitive world.
That's a real danger. There's even a term for it, the just world fallacy. It's our tendency to want to believe that people get what they deserve. It can make us passive, maybe even blame victims, because it's uncomfortable to accept that sometimes things aren't fair, and success doesn't always correlate perfectly with virtue. While we're waiting for the universe to be just, others are actively shaping their own outcomes.
So, okay, if the world isn't fair, and just being ruthless isn't sustainable, what's left? Do we just have to become calculating and strategic ourselves?
Well, the sources argue against seeing it as this simple binary choice. Either you're a shark or you're, shark bait.
Right.
The idea seems to be more about finding a synthesis, balancing integrity with strategic awareness, combining kindness with strength and resilience, realizing that fairness isn't something you just passively expect. Sometimes you have to actively work to create it, and that often requires having some degree of power and influence yourself.
Which I guess brings us back to Nietzsche again, and this concept of the Übermensch.
Yeah.
The Overman. That sounds like someone who gets beyond these dilemmas.
Exactly. The Übermensch for Nietzsche represents a potential way to transcend both the limitations of, say, a purely passive slave morality approach and the self-destructive tendencies of unchecked, crude ruthlessness.
So it's not about just being tougher or more dominant?
Not primarily. It's about rising above conventional morality altogether, above illusions, above self-imposed limits. It's fundamentally about self-overcoming, forging your own values, creating your own path.
Self-mastery, then, more than mastering others.
Absolutely. The focus is internal. It's about someone who doesn't just blindly accept the rules or moral codes handed down by society, but critically examines them and shapes their own destiny. It's a rejection of playing the victim and instead actively engaging with life's challenges to grow stronger.
And how does the will to power fit into this more nuanced picture? Is it still about power?
Yes, but understood differently, not just as crude domination, but as the fundamental drive within us to express our potential, to create, to grow, to transform ourselves and the world, to impose meaning on existence.
So it's more about control over oneself and one's creative energies.
That's a much closer interpretation in this context. You could contrast the purely ruthless person who might be seeking external validation, dominance over others, fleeting wins.
Right, playing a finite game.
Exactly, versus the Übermensch, whose strength is internal, who is focused on self-mastery and creation. They're playing a longer game, an infinite game perhaps, focused on building something lasting, on becoming more. Their power comes from within, not just from subjugating others.
Okay, this is fascinating stuff, but how do we actually, apply these big ideas? Maybe even thinking about something tangible, like building a business with integrity in a tough market.
Well, a key starting point seems to be shaking off that ingrained belief that life should always be fair, accepting the reality of competition, power dynamics, even the existence of ruthlessness. That's step one. It doesn't mean becoming cynical, but realistic.
Okay, accept reality. What then?
Then develop what some sources call strategic empathy. Understand the motivations, the drives, the likely actions of others, even the ruthless ones, without necessarily adopting their tactics or losing your own values.
So being savvy about how others operate without becoming like them.
Precisely. And crucially, focus on developing your internal power. That means embracing discomfort, taking calculated risks, building resilience, learning from failures. The Übermensch doesn't wait for permission or for conditions to be perfect. They create opportunities.
Actively creating, not just reacting.
Yes. And it involves distinguishing between, say, mindless aggression and controlled decisiveness. Sometimes making hard choices is necessary, even if they have difficult consequences. The key is making them for the right reasons, aligned with your core purpose, not just out of unchecked ambition or fear. Ultimately, the most sustainable path often involves creating genuine value, becoming indispensable through your contributions.
This really forces a rethink of power itself, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're so conditioned to see it as potentially negative, maybe even inherently evil.
Nietzsche really pushes back on that. He saw that drive, the will to power, as fundamentally about self-surpassing, about striving for growth, creating new values. Now, obviously, history shows countless examples of power corrupting.
Absolutely.
But Nietzsche might argue that's not inherent in power itself, but perhaps in the weaknesses or character flaws of those who seek it, or maybe how society's slave morality makes the very pursuit seem suspicious. He might even suggest that rejecting conventional morality in some cases isn't evil, but maybe embodies a raw, more authentic form of life striving for expression.
So the will to power isn't just this sinister urge to dominate, but could be an inner drive for a fuller existence, reaching one's potential.
That's the core of his more refined idea, yes.
Yeah.
Seen this way, pursuing influence or success, if the intent is focused on self-overcoming, creation, and perhaps contributing something meaningful, could actually be framed as an ethical endeavor.
It all comes down to the why behind the power. Self-growth versus just controlling others.
That seems to be the critical difference. Is power sought as an end in itself, often leading to destructive patterns? Or is it a means towards greater self-realization and creation? In the end, power is a tool. A potent one. And like any tool, its effect, constructive or destructive, depends entirely on the intention and the integrity of the person wielding it.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've journeyed through this tricky question of why seemingly bad people often succeed. We looked at Nietzsche's master and slave morality, the double-edged sword of ruthlessness, the illusion of a perfectly fair world.
Right, and landed on this idea of the Übermensch, not as a ruthless tyrant, but as someone who transcends these limitations through self-mastery, creating your own values.
Yeah, it suggests that navigating ambition doesn't have to mean selling your soul. It's more about being strategically aware, understanding the game.
While focusing on building your own inner strength, your own resilience, and your capacity to create real, lasting value, it's about playing the long game, perhaps.
So the final thought for you listening is, how do you take these insights and apply them to your own goals, your ambitions, maybe even thinking about the growth and impact of something like, say, Gourmet Treats by MRE in its own competitive space? How can you be strategic? How can you be strong and create value without falling into that trap of purely self-serving ruthlessness? Definitely something to chew on.